But man, I would put my money on Hafez being at the top of world literature. But listening to the Quran is a transcendent spiritual moment always. And I think Hafez has some of that too. And it just revealed the Quran to me in ways that were richer than when I had just been reading as a comparative religion scholar, that the divine is present and it is us that can't see it. But I do feel it's a quest for some kind of union to be one with that. And for me, the vehicle, it has been poetry. Most of my poetry has been very much focused on the lover-beloved dualism and the various forms that the divine takes. You know, I think the word is tajaliyat. So I went to Hafez's tomb, which is so beautiful, right? It is so serene. And I thought, wow, all of these pilgrims are not here for the stuff I was reading in Tehran. So I looked around and said to myself, I am going to learn to read these poems. And when I do, I'm going to make a translation. But I have to say, I learned more about writing English poetry from translating Hafez than I ever did from English writers. Because when you translate, especially when you try and translate Hafez, which is impossible, the number of translators who have failed at translating Hafez, there are thousands of them, and I count myself in the number of people that have failed at translating Hafez, enables a richness that I find unbelievably beautiful in terms of dealing with love, of all kinds of love, because I think that is ultimately what pulls us toward the light in whatever form it comes. The tongue of the obscene, of the unseen, speaks to every heart. Wherever that heart is, whatever language that heart speaks, whatever kind of love the heart is reveling in or suffering from.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. Today we are interviewing Dr. Elizabeth T. Gray, who is a poet, translator of classical and contemporary Persian literature and especially the Sufi literature. She has several books such as Wine and Prayer, 80 ghazals from the Dيوان of Hafez. It's a translation, obviously, from Dيوان حافظ الشيرازي. Another book is also The Green Sea of Heaven, 50 ghazals from the Dيوان of حافظ الشيرازي, and other publications also, which she will talk about and explain about. She also studied in Harvard, and she has interest in spirituality and comparative religion studies, maybe. She has a certain journey in life that we'd like to know about. So welcome, Doctor, and it's an honor having you with us today.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. As I mentioned earlier, I have listened to a number of your videos on this channel, and they're amazing. Thank you for doing this. And it's a complete honor to be added to the library.
Thank you very much. In the beginning, so tell us about your special journey in life, personal, academic, religious, spiritual, and the thirst to Persian literature and Hafiz, who's the main or the one of the best or top Persian poets. Tell us about this journey. What were the drives? What were the main causes of it in the beginning of your life? Your experience in Harvard with such important scholars also, of the colleagues that you were involved with, great teachers such as Anna Marie Shemel and others. So in the beginning, give us a summary about this journey that took more than 5 decades, I guess.
Well, When I was when I was young, our family lived close to a cemetery, an old New England burying ground, and I became very interested in the question of death, which leads very quickly to a question of what is life and what is beyond or whatever. By the time I was a teenager, Christianity didn't feel helpful in terms of answers. And in the late 1960s, early 70s, there was a it was a time of, Eastern religions. People were discovering Buddhism, they were discovering Hinduism, they were discovering Sufism, and they were discovering Zen, Buddhism in its number of forms. And I became very interested in Tibetan Buddhism, not because of some doctrinal understanding. I have to say, I didn't understand much about it at all at the time. But the idea of terrifying deities that could also be teachers, the idea that there is an absence, an impermanence at the center of things made sense to me. So I started to read Tibetan texts and the Bhagavad Gita. It was the hippie period. I was a hippie. And I left college, I left Harvard after my sophomore year and went to London and hitchhiked on trucks and trains to Kathmandu, Nepal, and then down to Sri Lanka, which sounds very daring, but at the time, there were a lot of young people doing that in a way that would be impossible today. And so I wanted to get to Tibet, but you couldn't get to Tibet because it was closed. So Nepal was the next best thing. And I have to say, I knew absolutely nothing about the countries between Istanbul and Nepal, nothing. And as I got to Eastern Turkey, I heard about that Iran had these poets, and the poets wrote these poems that sort of looked like sonnets. And they were love poems, but you couldn't tell whether they were love poems to an actual beloved or to God. And I thought, that is exactly the poetry I want to write. That is the essence of what poetic language does. It gets at what cannot be said. And so when I got to Tehran, I went right to the English language bookstores and bought these translations of Hafez. And I thought they were terrible. They had been done in the middle of the 19th century, and they had sing-songy rhymes, and they talked about roses and nightingales and wine. And I thought, well, this stuff isn't very good. So I gave up. And as I was going back down through Iran toward Baluchistan and to Quetta, I went through Shiraz. And I thought, well, Sadi and Hafez are buried here. I might as well go see their tombs. So I went to Hafez's tomb, which is so beautiful, right? It is so serene. And there were the gardens and the streams and, baits of his ghazals on the walls. And on his tomb, you had this alabaster tombstone with beautiful Nastaliq script. And there were pilgrims from all over the Eastern Islamic world. There were teachers. And I thought, wow, all of these pilgrims are not here for the stuff I was reading in Tehran. So I looked around and said to myself, I am going to learn to read these poems. And when I do, I'm going to make a translation that I wish I had had when I was here. And off I went. And I went down to Quetta and up into Afghanistan and fell in love with those countries and crossed into India and felt like I'd come home. I couldn't explain why I felt at home in India. I knew nothing about the country. I hadn't read any British histories or British fiction, or I really knew nothing about India. And when I literally crossed the border, the Wagah border outside of Lahore, I just fell in love with the subcontinent and got to Nepal and fell in love with Nepal, with the Himalaya, and went down to Sri Lanka and then went back and spent my last 2 years at Harvard. Now I knew exactly what I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn classical Persian. I wanted to learn Urdu. And I wanted to learn everything I could possibly learn in 2 years about Central Asia and India and Iran and Sufism and the poetry of those cultures. And I only had 2 years. So two things happened. I took as many courses as I possibly could, 7 or 8, some passed fail. And as soon as I specialized like that, I was in classes of 6 to 8 people, and they were all PhD students. So people like Jim Morris, the Ibn Arabi scholar, he and I sat next to each other in class for ages. We became best friends. And same with others. Most of them have gone on to be scholars in different places. Tom Barfield at BU is the head of the anthropology department studying nomads in northern Afghanistan and their impact on empires. So I stumbled into brilliant scholars that were studying Sufism, Islam, Islamic philosophy, and it was amazing. So after first year Persian, I turned to my teacher, Wheeler Thaxton, and said, I'm ready to translate Hafez now. And he laughed. And he paired me with Hossein Ziai, who was a graduate student at the time. And I started to work through translations of Hafez, line by line. And it was like studying at the feet of a master. I mean, I simply was so stunned by the beauty and transparency and ambiguity and clarity of his work that I was just stunned. And my first translations were terrible. But when I got out, I went back to Iran and studied at the University of Isfahan. And also in Tehran, at the time, Jim Morris was there. And he was studying with Syed Hossein Nasr and Toshihiko Izutsu at the Imperial Academy of Philosophy. And so I got to spend 6 months there, just as a scholar. And I guess what's interesting is that my narrow focus on wanting to translate what Hafez said, poet to poet, was a portal for me. Because in order to understand Hafez's lines, and Rumi and Attar and others, you can't do that without learning everything about the Quran and Islam and Islamic philosophy and Sufism and the prior Sufi poets and the practitioners and the different khanqahs and how that morphed into India. I had the opportunity to travel with Anne-Marie Schimmel through to various Sufi dargahs in North India with Bruce Lawrence, who's just got a new translation of the Quran coming out. So it was through Hafez that I developed, certainly not a professional academic solid background in all of this, but as a poet and a writer, I got all of that world opened up for me. And through my time in India, Hinduism and Buddhism also opened up for me. I spent time in the northwestern Himalaya on the Pakistan-Chinese border, tape recording versions of a Tibeto-Mongolian folk epic that I then spent some time helping Siddiq Wahid, who I also met at Harvard, bring into a literary English. And so that journey, the literal journey, to India, and I went back and spent time living in or studying in Iran, and spent time living and studying in India at different times, has opened out a variety of spiritual frameworks and literatures, all of which are very much focused on, I don't know, it's sort of, I guess, fana at the end of the journey, right? You realize you're 30 birds. You realize the mirror is your soul. And in some of the traditions, there's not a union with God, there's a realization of absence, but they're all after the same thing. And that was how I stumbled into the amazing tradition of Hafez and Sufism and Islam. And I keep thinking that, at some point I'll move on from that, but it hasn't happened yet.
Very interesting, Doctor. And you mentioned that you had a personal journey or a unique journey, maybe a deep spiritual quest for the divine. So your academic journey and poetry is a manifestation of a deeper quest that you encountered and lived through different stages. So if you would elaborate more on that also.
I think a seeker, a quest for wisdom, enlightenment, to be able to see the ineffable, to understand what can't be spoken, to be joined or understand or be part of some spiritual layer or world or moment that reveals, that is illuminating. I mean, to some extent, there's something called lyric time in poetry. And if a lyric poem is working correctly, it sort of, in my view, is lifted out of both chronological time and geographical space. And there's I'm not a theologian, but there are two different kinds of time. One is chronological time, and one is kairos, a sort of divine or mythical time that comes from Greek. And I suppose quantum physics is going to get there eventually, once it figures out what's going on with space-time at a quantum level. But I do feel it's a quest for some kind of union. Most of my poetry has been very much focused on the lover-beloved dualism and the array of feelings and longings and manifestations and ecstasies of a kind of union with the beloved, and the various forms that the divine takes. I think the word is tajaliyat, right? The different attributes. So my intuition tells me that what we see and what we experience, whatever tradition's word you use for it, are present, that the divine is present, and it is us that can't see it. And so I think the personal quest has been to explore methods, languages, mediums to be one with that. And for me, the vehicle, it has been poetry. I think people choose other Dharma practices or other paths to the same place, but I think the heart's quest feels the same to me. And it has taken me to art and literature, not necessarily, scholarship. But I have to say, I learned more about writing English poetry from translating Hafez than I ever did from English writers. Because when you translate, especially when you try and translate Hafez, which is impossible, the number of translators who have failed at translating Hafez. There are thousands of them, and I count myself in the number of people that have failed at translating Hafez because he is impossible to translate. But that difficulty, the shimmering complexity and polyvalence of his work and his images and the sound and his mastery of that, just the effort of trying to translate that into English pushes the boundaries of English. It has made me force English to do things that I didn't know it could do. And it has forced me to think about how to say something in ways that I would not have thought about had I not studied at the feet of Hafez. And I've also done some work with Rumi. My friend Iraj Anvar is a Rumi translator, and he and I have collaborated on Hafez. We've collaborated on Rumi, and both of them are extraordinary. Attar's Conference of the Birds is an unbelievably beautiful work. And translating any of them is impossible, but the process, the practice of trying is a quest of its own, and has been most illuminating to me as an English poet.
Interesting.
Is that responsive? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. You mentioned about your first visit and encounter with Hafiz to his tomb or shrine. So I'd just like to know more about that. Just explain your feelings and emotions and your first encounter towards Hafiz, and which kind of secret you felt which drove you towards the end of your life on working on him and translating him, or maybe you felt this mystery later, not from the first encounter. So my question is about the secret between yourself and dedicating your life to Hafiz and his poetry, and to the wisdom and spirituality that is gained in his poetry.
Well, our memory plays tricks on us. We don't remember things very well. But I do not remember anything about Shiraz when I was there. We were there for a couple of days. And I think I remember his tomb very vividly. And, I very much wanted to understand this poet. Everything I read about him said that he was the most perfect poet that captured everything about Persian culture and Persian life, and could be read in so many different ways, sort of human commentary, divine commentary, they all blended. And that sounded like exactly what poetry should do. And the translations were terrible, I thought. A part of that is, style, your taste in poetry changes. But when I got to his tomb, there was something. It was just the poems themselves were so beautiful. And there's actually a guy coming this weekend he's working on a documentary on the Nastaliq script. And I do think the Nastaliq script is sublime. And here's Hafez's poetry in Nastaliq script. And there are pilgrims everywhere, disciples studying with sheikhs. And, you had this walled garden of green with its cypresses and its roses and its water courses. And it was unbelievably quiet and unbelievably beautiful. I don't know whether it was God or who basically said, I need to read this in the original. A translation will not do it. I must have a direct relationship with these poems. And I want to be one with them. I want to be intimate spiritually with this work, to find, because maybe it is as amazing as they say. And
mhm,
really weren't a lot. I mean, I credit the Rumi translators of the 90s with bringing Western attention to classical Persian poetry. It had not been mainstream before. And now you see a lot of it. And I have my arguments with different translators and approaches to translating it. But at the time, there really wasn't any of that. And so I knew I could go back to Harvard and study this. And then I wanted to come back to Iran and stand in that garden and read the poems myself.
Very interesting. And later on, how you strengthened your Persian language skills and also Arabic skills. So, have you tried to learn Arabic along with Persian, and back then your proficiency in Persian and a bit of Arabic was better than now, obviously.
Yeah, yes, because I've not sustained, my study in that field. Um, Even at the time, I was not fluent in contemporary Persian because I didn't actually want to learn Persian. I wanted to read Hafez. Some people study a language because they want access to all that comes with it, a civilization, a culture, a land, a community of people. I just wanted to read this guy. And so if it wasn't directly related to Hafez and translating Hafez, then I didn't pay that much attention to it. I mean, I used to joke with people that I could read several different words for nightingale and rose, and I had all the vocabulary and the verb structures and the grammar for 14th century classical poetry, but I couldn't really read a newspaper. And, I had to acquire some of that background civilizational knowledge. But, now I did not learn Arabic, and I thought about learning Arabic. I thought about getting a PhD in some flavor of Near Eastern and Middle Eastern studies because all of my friends were doing that. And it seemed an endlessly interesting set of fields. But I also wanted to write American poetry. I was interested in business. I went to law school. And so while I have stayed connected to scholars and to Iranians, my best friend is married to an Iraqi. She's the godmother of my children. So her son is living in Dubai. I've stayed engaged with that world, but not at the way. It's a path I didn't take, right? We make our choices along whatever path we're on. And I didn't. And so my world has been rich in different ways.
I'd like to delve more with you now about the content of Hafiz or Sufism. So in the beginning, they say that one of the main characteristics of the Persian language is that it is the language of love. And love is manifested in its most beautiful ways in Hafiz, Rumi, Saadi, and all these people, but Hafiz, obviously. So after your experience with his poems and ghazals, so how would you say that the Persian language of Hafiz himself was able to manifest the depth and reality of love? How would you explain this for us? And which kind of love he's talking about, an earthly love, a divine love, or a love that encompasses all these levels of feelings together?
Well, I'm sure that people have spoken more eloquently than I can about this, but it does seem to me that across Hafez's work, there is no aspect or nuance of love that is not present. And in that sense, it feels to me like a culmination of the incredible work that preceded his from Attar and Rumi and others. It all comes together. And so there's no aspect of love that I think exists that he hasn't written about. And I think what I find most illuminating and most challenging as a writer myself is the way in which he uses the ambiguity of who he is talking about. The lover and the beloved are not often clear. They're fluid. And the fluidity, which is enhanced by the fact that, right, Persian does not have gendered pronouns. When he's talking to thou, you don't know whether the thou, the beloved, is male or female, young or old, human or divine, whether it's a political divinity or an actual divinity. And that ambiguity, which other languages don't have, you can't do that in English in the same way. Believe me, I tried. Enables a richness that I find unbelievably beautiful in terms of dealing with love, of all kinds of love, because I think that is ultimately what pulls us toward the light in whatever form it comes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, also Hafez manages to pull into the lattice of his work legends and science and history and myth and his range of tone, right? He's mocking in some places and he's praying in some places and he's aggravated in some places and he can scold the beloved and he can plead with the beloved. And I just think it's all there. There's a reason they do Faleh Hafez, right? There's a reason that his work is used for divination. It's because it's all there. As what is it? The tongue of the obscene, of the unseen, speaks to every heart. Wherever that heart is, whatever language that heart speaks, whatever kind of love the heart is reveling in or suffering from. I think it's all there. I think it's, you know, I mean, I can't read every language. I can't read every poet on the planet in their own language, because unless you can read them in their own language, you don't really understand it. But man, I would put my money on Hafez being at the top of world literature. I mean, I just think there's more going on with him than there is with Shakespeare. And that, you know, he's more playful and more diverse than many of the religious texts of the world. I mean, I can't read Arabic, but listening to the Quran is a transcendent spiritual moment always. And I think Hafez has some of that too. But
لسان
I hate to sound like a gushy person, but I'm just telling you how I think of it.
the tongue of the unseen, لسان الغيب, it's known in Persian and Arabic. It's an Arabic word, لسان الغيب, and it's true what you said about the Faleh Hafiz. And actually, Hafiz was a memorizer of the Quran. That's why they call him
Right.
Hafiz.
That's what I mean.
He's one of the deep spiritual and mystical manifestations of the meanings of the layers of the deep layers of the Quran in his poetry, in a certain manifestation. So a certain soul that encountered the deep meanings of the Quran and who transform it through the beauties of poetry and give us this great book.
Yes, one of the things that, you know, I had read the Quran when I was traveling, because I'm always interested in the major spiritual text of a religion. But it was through Hafez that I came back to parts of the Quran for precisely the reason you say. He had it memorized, which means that the language of the Quran was always in him, and the stories and the language and the sound and the light comes into his work. And so it was through Hafez's work and trying to understand some of the layered meanings in and behind his lines that took me back to the Quran in translation, And it just revealed the Quran to me in ways that were richer than when I had just been reading as a comparative religion scholar. So
just to help us taste Hafiz more, so you talked about love. If you would give us an example, a meaning, a theme that he talks about, for example, just to let us taste this flavor that he's talking about. So you explained in general, but
yeah,
you recall a certain theme, a certain...
I do. And in fact, this morning I spent some time looking through to find some of the most amazing ghazals that I thought he had for us. And there was one, I'm going to, my Persian accent is terrible. So I don't really want to, you'll have to just forgive me. It's the last line of a ghazal. Bia o hastiye Hafez ze pish ou tarbad o barbad ke ba vujud to kas nashnavad zaman ke manam. You can't do that in English, right? The English version, that the best I could do was come and take Hafez's existence from him. Because as long as there is you, no one will hear from me that I am I. Now, there are other ways to translate that. You could say, come take Hafez's life from him or kill him. I mean, that's not there in the Persian. But as long, in English, there are two different ways. You can say, as long as you exist, as long as there is you in the world, no one will hear from me that I am I, because I am not separate from you. But to me, it is the most efficient, beautiful, gorgeous way of describing essentially fana, right? And so it's amazing to me how he does that. So there's an example. There was also one where he talks about آتش آنیست که بر شعله او خندد شمع. آتش آن است که در خرمن پروانه زدند. Please forgive my terrible Persian accent. But so I think it's fana that interests me, right? Love is not the cute little candle flame. Love is a heap of burned moths. And that, that Hafez can write of that in a way that also incorporates everything else in the ghazal. Those things really speak to me. I mean, at the end of them, I go, wow, wow. And it's very hard to do that in English. I mean, I certainly can't. But, so there's my teacher. That kind of love, I think, is uniquely Sufic and Islamic. The Indian idea of Atman, or the Buddhist idea of Nirvana, none of it seems to have that self-immolation, on al-haq, right?
But fana is such a complicated, very difficult concept or state or reality, even for very few people who have overgone these spiritual states. So how does it apply to us or to you personally?
I am not in the same league with Hallaj or Ibn Arabi or any of those guys. I don't know. I think that maybe it's a fantasy that there is a love that is so consuming that you lose yourself in it. And in the West, with Petrarch and the troubadours and the whole Western rise of love poetry, where the beloved is a beautiful woman most of the time. I think that's different than this existential level of annihilation. It's not a union like, oh, we're going to go off into the sunset. It is a transcending. It is I don't know, you realize that the 30 birds are the sea mark after all. And in daily life, I mean, I don't think about it all the time, but I think that somewhere out there, as the way a compass points to north, I think that that matters to me, that there is, that at some point, whether it's through a chain of lives, whether it's in this life, whether we live parallel lives, I don't think we fully understand how that works. So different religious traditions have taken different models for explaining a phenomenon, a mystical phenomenon that I think moves across all human societies. We have different frames for it, as your comparative religion professors on your various videos have talked about. But I think it's like a compass pointing to north, that there is that possible level of transcendence and illumination and understanding, which is both an annihilation and a remaining. Isn't it Fanon Baka? I forget, it's been a long time. So that you dwell in union and annihilation, right? Non-being, non-creativeness. I'm trying to read Michael Sells, who's a friend, his book on the language of the unseeing. I think that's the title. I should have done more homework. He talks about how in language, people like Ibn Arabi and other mystics have created, by using language, in the language itself, the grammar, the utilization of it, that space where that happens in the language itself. And, you know, as a writer and a seeker, that would be what I have my eye on. As I come toward the end of my life, I find I don't have much patience for everyday things. I just want to focus on this kind of a goal.
Very interesting. And Doctor, regarding your interesting book title, Wine and Prayer, so why you chose these two themes from Hafez, wine and prayer, and what's the relation between them? And it's obviously a symbolic wine. Wine is also a symbol for fana and transcending towards the divine.
Well, first, the first title, right, when I did the first 50 ghazals that I translated, were going to be published in Tehran at the Imperial Academy in the late 70s. And with the revolution, that became impossible. So some of them were published in literary magazines, but I went to law school and started an international consulting firm. And a publisher called me and said, I want to publish these. I've been looking for you. So they were originally published as The Green Sea of Heaven, which is a line from one of the ghazals about Haji Kavam. And when the second printing ran out and they were going to reissue it with 30 more ghazals, which I worked on with my friend Hira Channel, they decided to change the name to Wine and Prayer. And I don't know, I'm not in the book business, but I think they thought that it would be catchier with the people that had grown up on Rumi and on, you know, The Imposter, the Modai of Dan Ladinsky, and some of these other translators, many of whom just leave Islam out. You know, Omid Safi at North Carolina wrote this beautiful article in Al Jazeera about, you know, these Western translators that are interested in New Age love. They strip Islam out of these works. You know, they forget Rumi was a theologian. They forget Hafez memorized the Quran. So I wasn't wild about the title. And there is a 30th anniversary edition that is coming out this year that will go back to Green Sea of Heaven. So I don't like Wine and Prayer. but I think that it was supposed to make the book more attractive.
Interesting. What about the Green Sea of Heaven? What's the story of that? You said about Haji Qawam, the Green Sea of Heaven. What does that mean?
It's a line from one of the ghazals. I forget what it is in Persian, but the Green Sea of Heaven and the boat of the moon, right? The sailboat of the moon are both swamped by the generosity of Haji Qawam, which was clearly a patron. I mean, I can't remember what the footnote said about him, but I think he was a patron of Hafez's. And the publisher on the first round thought that would be a great title. I'm not sure I think it was a great title, but it is the title that the book became known for. And when it gets reissued now, it's going to come out under that name because the original book was well received by both scholars and poets. And the criticism of the translations is they're too literal, they're too scholarly, they don't, you know, they don't make you feel good. They're not, like some of the translations of Rumi or Omar Khayyam or whatever. And my answer is that as I have gone through the years of being a translator, I am more and more biased toward a literal translation. I don't think that I can improve on Hafez's poetry. I think that my job, my gift as a translator is to bring to an English reader the closest approximation that I can to what he actually wrote. And to not have it sound terrible, not have it be like some Google Translate, but to have the footnotes, to have essays on how they work, on the sound, on the rhyme scheme. And even with all that, you can get maybe 20% of Hafez to an English reader. But you can't just say, well, you need to go learn Persian because this guy is such a great poet that the only answer is to go learn Persian. That's what I did, and it worked for me.
It also depends on the spiritual thirst, and the people who read with their hearts will gain more, and it's due to the abilities and capabilities of the pure hearts that can penetrate through language. Language is only a tool to delve through meaning, so it depends on every seeker and what he seeks, and so it's also graces from God. It's not only language, and you know better, and you. As you mentioned the conference of birds several times, so I just want to ask you about that, because I ask many scholars about their perception about or their experience with the idea of the conference of birds. So if you can just summarize, what does it mean for you, or what is it? What's the journey about? So the 30 birds, and they're searching about what, and it's all about the ethics and the birds that are not capable of continuing the road. So how do you understand and explain the story for our viewers?
Well, I'm not a scholar of the whole work, but I did spend 50 years living with a parrot, a tuti shakarhor. And I think one of the things that interests me most about that work is all the reasons that the birds have for not going on the journey. The owl wants to hang out among the ruins. The parrot is really pretty and wants to stay in its cage and be fed. The sparrow is too, everybody has their excuse for not taking the path. And so to me, that's very interesting as all of the reasons we give ourselves to not follow through as a seeker. Because it is terrifying and it is challenging and it is exhausting to go through valley after valley after valley. And at the end of it, I do think it's like a mirror. Here we are, we've arrived at the Seamork, this amazing bird, the feather fell down and from China or whatever. But when you make that quest at the end of it, you both are the community of selves or of self. And what you realize when you're allowed access to the scene work, that it's a mirror, that it's us, the nature, that which we seek, we can be granted access to, and it is in our own soul as well as with God. And I think your comment about people sometimes people can't read the poem. They're not granted access to it, no matter how much they study. I think that's true. And I think that what I love about Attar's epic is that they are granted access to an understanding which is both self and divine. Yeah? So they're both.
Very interesting, Doctor. We're enjoying the time with you, and we're reaching towards the end of this interesting talk. So many of the Western scholars, when they come across Islam or Sufism or the spiritual dimensions of Islam or the religion in general, or they come across Hafiz, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Mullah Sadra, Sahrawardi, all these great mystics and philosophers and people of wisdom. So they change their life. Their life is transformed, and some choose to embody Islam, transfer the religion. Some start doing some rituals, prayer and fasting, and reading the verses of Quran, and some also transfer totally. And every person has his unique experience and his decision in what to make. So for you personally, after encountering Hafiz, Persian language, you talked about Quran, and so and you are from a Christian background, I guess. So what's the kind of spirituality or kind of religious understanding or rituals that you chose or that you are still on?
That's an excellent question. I think I have not been someone comfortable adopting the dogma of a faith. I did not feel comfortable in Christianity. I think adopting Islam is not always a wonderful place to be if you're a woman in the present day. But Hinduism is interesting to me because I feel as if in the monotheistic religions, right, all the attributes come together in a single center. It's like a centripetal force. And what's interesting about Hinduism and the Vajrayana tantric versions of Buddhism that you see in Tibet are that they are centrifugal. It's like you have the divine that manifests itself going in the other direction in all these crazy deities. I remember walking through a village in South India, and here was this little goddess, and it was the goddess of the local smallpox variety. So they brought her yogurt every morning so they wouldn't get smallpox. And I think that's pretty far out on the centrifugal end. So I think as a personal practice, I think writing poetry is like a Dharma practice. And the poetry is a quest to write what cannot be said. And that I see commonalities across these religions and across the mystical texts. And I have not been systematic about studying these things as you and others have. It is very much a belief that things will be placed in front of me that are talisman or maps, and that staying true to the impulse, which is described differently, in different traditions, is what I stay true to. And so I think there are rituals. I mean, I love sacred spaces. When I am at a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, I circumambulate, the stupas, just like as if they were the Kaaba, right? There are ritual behaviors that center you. It's like zikr. There are forms of meditation. And I've trained in different kinds of meditation. I wish I had a clear answer for you. but I guess I'm just a heathen.
And coming across some of the Buddhist or the Hindu sacred or spiritual texts, which kind of similarities and commonalities and you find with the Islamic Sufism? You mentioned An al-Haq and these kind of beauties and strengths that you only find in Hallaj and Ibn Arabi and Rumi and Hafiz Sufism. So do you find similarities between this and the Eastern heritage like Buddhism and others, or you mentioned something like you find a certain kind of unique strength in the Islamic Sufi understanding that is also not found in the Eastern religions?
I think that what the texts that attract me in all these religions are the ones that deal with some kind of enlightenment. You know, whether it's called enlightenment as it is in Buddhism, or whether it's called, you know, divine union. I think that experience, I'm not well read in the Christian mystics, but that experience, the seeking of union, the seeking to annihilate the self in some moment of transcendent understanding. I think if you actually asked me the tradition in which I am most thoroughly educated about the mystical path is Islamic Sufism, precisely from the years of working on Hafez. But the, you know, the states and stations of the path, I understand conceptually what those are in Islam, but they are not so dissimilar in my experience from states and stations toward enlightenment in other religions, whether, I mean, the Jesuits, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, also move the seeker along a path that has stages and stations. And, you know, the paired states that you see in Sufism, those feel intuitively correct to me. So I think that's not the answer you were looking for, but none of the above, all of the above.
Interesting. I just wanted to ask you about Anna Mary Schimmel. She's just a secret and a beautiful soul, and so you encountered her. So, what memories or what do you know about her? How can you describe her for us, especially that you encountered her?
She was teaching at Harvard when I was there, and she was working on. When I was there, she had not yet come out with The Mystical Dimensions of Islam and Two Colored Brocade, which were, she had come out with her Rumi book, but she hadn't come out with the other two yet. And she was a revered figure, you know, definitely the sheikh on campus that we wanted to go study with. And she would come in and sit down at her desk at the front of the classroom. And she would put her hands on the desk and she would close her eyes and she would talk for 50 minutes. And we were just transported, writing stuff down as fast as we could. And, you know, there were all kinds of rumors about her that she really was a time traveler because she never got jet lag. And she was just a towering figure in the field. And she told me that Hafez was impossible to translate. And I was stupid to even try. And I said, thank you, Professor Schimmel, right? This is one of my spiritual practices in life, and I will fail at it, but that's okay. And then when I was in India, Bruce Lawrence from Duke was studying the Chishti Sufi order, and he was in Aligarh. And so I went and spent a couple of weeks in Aligarh with him, studying with Waris Kermani there. And we were reading some Bedel, which was also interesting to me. I had not encountered him. And then Bruce turned to me and he said, you know, Anne-Marie Schimmel is going to be here for 2 weeks. We're going to go travel through the various Sufi shrines in North India, Kachaucha Sharif, Dargah Sharif. And he said, why don't you come with us? I'm like, I get to go visit Sufi shrines with Anne-Marie Schimmel? And he said, yeah. So So I did. And it was wonderful getting to know her as a person. She had an amazing sense of humor. Um, she was and one of the immortals. Now we're talking Taoism, but yeah, she was incredible to learn from and to study with and to travel with.
Very interesting. I'll leave the final question for you to fill, but I'd like to ask, so as a poet and your experience with poetry, not only translating Hafiz, so you also have your own poetry and you taste poetry when you read, and especially Shakespeare also. Yeah, I had a question about Shakespeare because Martin Lings also wrote the mystical dimensions of Shakespeare. So how do you perceive Shakespeare in this context? But also, how did poetry enable you to discover your inner spirituality, like doing and practicing poetry, as you explained, it's your ritual. How did it help you to encounter your soul, your virtues, your ethical path, your life, wisdom? So, the final question, I'll just leave it with you. Your experience with poetry in terms of discovering your real self and or your relation with God and the divine. And you may also like to comment about Shakespeare or any other thing to just finalize this talk.
Well, I can't remember when poetry mattered to me. I think it must have been my mother reading to me lots and lots of English poetry. But by the time I was 4 or 5, I wanted to be a poet. I thought it was the most important thing to be in the world. My mother she collected my collected poems when I was 7 years old. So obviously I had written enough poetry by then. So and I had written it out on paper. She stapled them all together. And I have a copy of my collected poetical works from when I was 7 years old. So, whether that was a gift given to me by God at birth or from a prior life, I don't know. But it is the only thing that I have ever felt was the most important thing, and that it was my mechanism. That was my tool for the spiritual path, whatever the spiritual path was. And obviously, as you can tell, I've spent a lot of time wandering around looking at different spiritual paths, almost like trying to figure out what of those traditions is right for me. The way those guys go to a beach, they have an electric magnet thing and they walk up and down the beach looking for coins and looking for treasure. It feels like that to me. So poetry has always been there. And, I had to make a living. I had family and, I have communities of friends. But poetry is the through line. And there's just nothing that is more rewarding to me. When I'm writing, I do not know what time it is or where I am. When I'm revising, I know where I am, but the process of being in time, in the flow of it. And that's why people like Hafez just blow me away, because clearly they are standing at the summit of that practice, both as seekers and poets.
What about death? Does Hafiz talks about it, explained it, the reality of death, the image of death? Hafiz talks about it in his poems, or?
I don't think I've actually gone through the Dيوان and thought about death imagery, but it's always been to me a central mystery. And when he does talk about it, it's come to my grave, drink wine, dance on it. The idea that you transcend it, you can talk about it. We're dust. Does he have an answer on death? Not anymore, I think, than others, but we're all trying to deal with that central mystery. And, I think religions, to some extent, I'm not a comparative religion person. I suspect that they arose out of fearing death and being baffled by death and being baffled by life. We need to, we're humans, we make a story. There has to be some way to explain this. And we have teachers and enlightened people that can see more clearly than we do, and they bring back a story that works for us.
Doctor, thank you very much for being with us and sharing your experience and your knowledge and the beauty of Hafiz.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for including me, Hadi.